Let me begin with a confession. This has been my maiden attempt to participate in this tech-driven venture of the IHC. And I must also say that I am a reluctant participant because of my own ignorance about this technology. I wouldn't have yielded to the persuasion of Professor Mahalakshmi if she had not really promised me technical assistance at my door. She not only promised, she really ensured that two young ladies with me, Sneha and Deepana, uh, whom I would prefer to call quite technical wizards, they visited my house almost 10 days ago and set up everything for me. And if I am able to address you all this morning, it's largely because of their assistance. I must thank both of them with the bottom of my heart. I would also like to say that there is a small amendment in the title of my presentation. It now reads, Shambhuk Speaks, Revisiting Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar's Riddles in Hinduism. I do not intend getting into the semantic issues involved in defining civilization, except to underline that in its sheer historical perspective, its numerous strands should be located spatially and temporally. Further, since all societies are generally never static bodies and are inherently mobile and dynamic, their interpersonal human relations as well as their cultural manifestations are also bound to be eternally in a flux. Civilization, therefore, needs to be seen as an evolving process. Agencies that get into the act of defining or enumerating its various strands also need to be historically located. In consonance with the IHC concept note, I have absolutely no quarrels with the vision of Indian civilization found in Rabindranath Tagore and Jawaharlal Nehru as useful starting points for deciphering the constituents of Indian civilization. Indeed, any real student of Indian history would have no qualms in recognizing and conceding that the genesis of India's multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual, and pluralistic character goes back to at least the Rigvedic times, second millennium BCE, and even before that, if we go by the current assessments of anthropologists, archaeologists, and such scientists as are involved in the nebulous DNA studies and investigations. A word of caution, however, may not be out of place. We, the professional historians, have often lamented the absence of voices of the downtrodden and underlined the need of reading these absences and retrieving such voices. Let's not forget that all visions are, in the ultimate analysis, constructs rooted in certain milieu. It may therefore not be too unfair to suggest that visions of Tagore and Nehru may seem to have been rooted in their upper-class privileged environs of Brahmanic influences. Perhaps we can do with some such visions as well that came from other quarters and tended to be what the IHC concept note calls disruptive influences. With such a quest, we propose here to revisit Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar's riddles in Hinduism, henceforth called just the riddles. However, its larger significance in the present-day India can be better understood if it is juxtaposed to Max Muller's India, What Can It Teach Us? First published in 1882, it comprised 7 lectures delivered at Cambridge in 1882 to the ICS aspirants at the invitation of the Board of Historical Studies. Ironically, these lectures came to mean more to Indian nationalists than to those who set out to govern India. We give below a few extracts from this small monograph to underline what does India mean to Max Muller and to whom does he refer as us. And I quote about 4 extracts from that monograph. First, I'm not pleading here for Gonds or Bhils or Santals and other non-Aryan tribes. I'm speaking of the Aryans and more or less civilized inhabitants of India. Second, my interest lies altogether with the people of India when left to themselves, and historically I should like to draw a line after the year 1000 after Christ. When you read the atrocities committed by the Mohammedan conquerors of India from that time to the time when England stepped in, the wonders to my mind is how any nation could have survived such an inferno. Third, after reading the accounts of terrors and horrors of Mohammedan rule, my wonder is that so much of native virtue, implying justice and truthfulness, should have survived. And finally, I maintain then that for a study of man, or if you like, for a study of Aryan humanity, there is nothing in the world equal in importance with the Vedas. I maintain that to everybody who cares for himself, for his ancestors, for his history, or for his intellectual development, a study of Vedic literature is indispensable. In short, Max Muller is obsessed with A, the Aryans, B, India comprising civilized Aryans and not their numerous tribes, darkness of the rule of Mohammedans, even amongst the Aryans, we the northern Aryans of cooler climatic zone meant us, and the southern Aryans of the warmer territories denoted they. Further, for him, India's spiritual heritage belonging to the realm of transcendence and not mundane matters is to be seen in its real Sanskrit literature that belonged to the pre-Turanian times. In contrast, the non-Sanskrit heritage of the Buddhists and the Jains stemmed from vulgar dialects. Most of these ideas and the year 1000 CE as the divider between the so-called Hindu and Muslim India are the commonalities that Max Muller shares with the modern-day cultural nationalists in India. Unlike other Orientalists, such as the pioneer William Jones, he was perhaps closer to the utilitarians, such as James Mill, who had laid the foundations of the communal periodization of Indian history by charting the horrors and tyrannies of Muslims. Apparently, this image was at the back of Max Muller's mind when he unhesitatingly caricatured the Mohammedans as an inferno. The India and the Indian civilizational heritage in Ambedkar's riddles, as available to us now, stands in total contrast to the aforesaid construct of Max Muller. And this is despite Baba Sahib citing him approvingly on questions of chronology of some Sanskrit texts. One of Muller's foundational bases was completely knocked out when Ambedkar adamantly rejected the Aryan invasion race theory, describing it, and I quote, so absurd that it ought to have been dead long ago, unquote. And this was in his book, Who Were the Shudras, that was published in 1946. Incidentally, when Jawaharlal Nehru was writing his discovery of India during his imprisonment in Ahmednagar Fort between 1942 and 1945 and got it published in 1946, Dr. Ambedkar was going through tremendous mental turmoil in search of his own religious identity. During the Mahat Satyagraha, he had already publicly burned the Manusmriti, one of the most revered texts of the Hindus, on the 25th December 1927. Further, in October 1935, he is also known to have made his classic statement, and I quote, I had the misfortune of being born with the stigma of an untouchable. However, it's not my fault, but I will not die a Hindu, for this is in my power, unquote. Since that year, he had been exploring possibilities of conversion to other religions, beginning with Sikhism. He also weighed pros and cons of getting converted to Christianity and Islam. Surprisingly, his initial efforts began with negotiations with Dr. Balkrishna Shivaram Munje, the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, who had already been talking to Mussolini, the Italian fascist. Apparently, Munje was agreeable to conversion into any religion of Indian origin and persuaded him to avoid Abrahamic religions. Baba Sahib's quest lasted for almost 2 decades and only culminated in his conversion to Buddhism on the 14th October 1956, just about 7 weeks before his death. Though the chronology of the writing of Ambedkar's riddles is somewhat hazy, yet one may hazard a guess that his 32 odd pieces may have been in the making during the 2 decades of his explorations after his pronouncement in October 35. A recent annotated edition of the work that includes only 7 pieces has mentioned that 4 press copies of the manuscript were prepared between 1954 and 1955. Apparently, we have reasons to believe that none of them really got published during Baba Sahib's lifetime, and that it was more than 3 decades after his death that riddles got published in 1987. This was at a time when the movement for liberation of Ayodhya had taken off and gaining considerable momentum. No wonder copies of the volume were publicly burnt at a Maratha Mahamandal meeting in Amravati in January 1988, and the Shiv Sena too rioted and sought the removal of the riddle of Ram and Krishna that was included as an appendix under the section of political riddles. The demand provoked a counter-protest by countless Dalits in Maharashtra, forcing the government to restore the chapter, but only with a disclaimer, namely, and I quote, "The government does not concur with the views expressed in this chapter," unquote. Surprisingly, the recent reprint of 2014, undertaken by the Dr. Ambedkar Foundation in the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, Government of India, that disclaimer is still present. Plan of the riddles in Hinduism. The 24 riddles and 8 appendices contained in this monograph have been classified into 3 parts, namely religious, social, and political respectively. The first part, comprising of 15 religious plus 5 appendices, focus on the Vedas, the Vedic tradition, breaches within the Vedic tradition, their infallibility and their moral or spiritual values, machinations of Brahmins, and finally, issues of Himsa and Ahimsa. The second part, 5 riddles plus 2 appendices, is largely concerned with the Varnashram Dharma in its varied facets. It also has Ambedkar's very analytical piece, and I quote, "Manu's madness or the Brahmanic explanation of the origin of mixed castes," unquote. 2 other interesting pieces in this part are A, the change from paternity to maternity. What did the Brahmins wish to gain by it? Unquote. And secondly, Kali Varje, or the Brahmanic art of suspending the operation of sin without calling it sin. Finally, the third part, comprising of 4 riddles plus 1 appendix, has 2 pieces on the Kali Yuga and the riddle of Ram and Krishna as an appendix. In his introduction, Ambedkar sets out the purpose of the riddles thus, and I quote, "This book is an exposition of the beliefs propounded by what might be called Brahmanic theology. It is intended for the common mass of Hindus who need to be awakened to know in what quagmire the Brahmins have placed them and to lead them onto the road of rational thinking," unquote. Indeed, an exposition to enlighten the masses is the subtitle of the book. Apart from this volume of 32 pieces, there are at least another 15 included in volumes 3 and 5 that deal with ideas and themes comparable with those of the riddles mentioned above. However, for the present, these are not being discussed in this presentation. A few words about the methodology. Central to Ambedkar's methodology was a need for what he called an act of doubting, or in other words, questioning the extant knowledge. He calls the infallibility of the Vedas as the mischievous dogma spread by the Brahmins among the masses, and this dogma must be destroyed root and branch if India is to progress, unquote. Extensively researched with countless references to the original text, the riddles is replete with authors' high pessimism about the possibility of evolving a humane religion based on such texts. Such an assessment had already been made by him in his Annihilation of Caste. And I quote, "You must not forget that if you wish to bring about a breach in the system, you have got to apply the dynamite to the Vedas and Shastras, which deny any part to reason and morality. You must destroy the religion of the Shrutis and the Smritis. Nothing else will avail," unquote. Ambedkar is usually very keen to demonstrate internal contradictions within the Sanskrit textual tradition, be it the issue of the origin of the Vedas or of their infallibility, origin of the Chaturvarna, and other major components of what is generally identified as Hinduism. However, unlike Phule or Periyar, Baba Sahib was never too concerned with the day-to-day lives of the Brahmins and other Dvijas. So stylistically, he gives the impression of being more intellectual and philosophical. To illustrate, though he says in the Annihilation, and I quote, "The caste system is not merely a division of labor, it is also a division of laborers," unquote. And yet, his riddles does not deal with this contempt for labor. Ambedkar's critique of the long trail of Sanskrit texts from the Rigveda to the Puranas shows a complete departure from productive culture of the working caste in India. These are supposedly tasks to be done by the Rakshasas, Shudras, and Chandalas. The Brahmins till this day have not given up their anathema for productive jobs and continue to hold dear the purity pollution theory. Of course, they have enjoyed being absentee landlords for millennia. Their construct of the Kali Yuga is to underline the disregard for the Varnashram Dharma, particularly by the Shudras and untouchables. I wish that Ambedkar had also reflected on the post-6th century epigraphic evidence about descriptions of the Kali Yuga and exhortations from Brahmin Purohitas to kings about the paramount need of restoring the Varnashram Dharma. In it, it is this indefensible theoretical edifice that Ambedkar launches himself against in the riddles. Ambedkar wanted to examine the moral strength of textual Hinduism, be it Vedic hymns that are full of magic, or the latter-day mythological tales of gods, conceit, treachery, and untruths. No religion offers an elaborate justification for such injustice as Hinduism does, so says Baba Sahib. As already noticed, Max Muller was somewhat contemptuous of non-Sanskrit texts of the Buddhists and the Jains. In contrast, Ambedkar drew upon his study and knowledge of the Buddhist texts, which he thought offered a counter to the sacred Hindu text, totally lacking in morality and ethics, counts on which he found Abrahamic religions to be relatively more honest. Citing the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, he shows how the Brahmins, unlike the Jews, were never steadfast to their gods. We need to keep in view that anthology on the whole is quite haphazard. It is also somewhat repetitive. To give one example, the riddle of the Ved as the first appendix in the first part is only a consolidated narrative of 5 riddles which have already been mentioned above. Baba Sahib's special ire is reserved for the Manusmriti, the Brahmins, and the Chaturvarna, the fourfold social order. By and large, they emerge as villains par excellence, since all issues raised by him are in the form of riddles. All chapters generally end in an open-ended interrogative format. Even the occasional answers given by Ambedkar, which are not too many, are more in the speculative mode. Let's now review some important riddles of the monograph and Ambedkar's take on them. I have arranged them under certain themes, and I begin with the first one, riddles on the Vedas and Vedic literature. While most of the Hindus would concede the Vedas as the most sacred book of their religion, but they would be unlikely to explain their origin. Commenting on these being Sanatana, it is argued that the real question is who made them and not who reproduced them. They could not have come into being ex nihilo. Why this circumlocution by the Brahmins? Taking stock of long list of texts from the Rigveda to the Harivamsa Purana, Ambedkar is able to locate 11 different explanations regarding the origin of the Vedas. He is bewildered by the multiplicity of incoherent and chaotic answers given by Brahmins of the same Vedic school of thought. Similarly, on the question of the Vedas being infallible, for they are aparusheya, that is not made by men, Baba Sahib is able to harness even enough empirical evidence to debunk the theory. He mocks at the illogicality of Jaimini's desperate attempt for establishing a desperate conclusion, namely, the Vedas were neither man-made nor made by God. He leaves us with the question: was it because the Vedas had been made the exponent of the Chaturvarna with the Brahmins as the lord of all? With allusions to Wilson's understanding of the Rig Veda and Charvaka's take on the Vedas, Ambedkar strongly contends that they contain nothing that can be said to be spiritually or morally elevating. He also added that he had deliberately omitted a good many obscene passages to be found in the Rig Veda and the Yajur Veda. Why then did the Brahmins struggle so hard to clothe them with sanctity and infallibility? That's Baba Sahab's question. In a chapter originally titled The Suppression of the Vedas, but later changed to The Turn of the Tide, or How Did Brahmins Declare Vedas to be Lower than the Lowest of Their Shastras, Ambedkar undertakes a sweeping survey of religious literature of the Hindus. Here he draws attention to what he calls acrobatics of Brahmins to conclude, and I quote, "The Brahmins have not been very steadfast in their belief regarding the sacred character of what they called their books of religion. They had not the slightest compunction to overthrow the position of the Vedas and to subordinate them first to the Shrutis, then to the Smritis, then to the Puranas, and lastly to the Tantras," unquote. The authors of the Tantras went much beyond. They claimed that the Vedas, the Shastras, and the Puranas are like common women, but the Tantras are like a high-born woman. Once again, Ambedkar accuses the Brahmins of being collaborators in this design. In another riddle concerning the Upanishads, he relies on Max Muller's etymological derivation of the root sad, meaning to destroy, in these texts to postulate that there was a time when the relationship between the Vedas and the Upanishads was of antagonism. How the two came to be seen as complementary is a riddle for Ambedkar. Next, the riddles on Hindu gods and goddesses. Ambedkar's probing reflections and queries on the Hindu gods and goddesses figure in several chapters. Ambedkar has no problem with idolatry and polytheism amongst the Hindus, despite the fact that there are no references to anthropomorphic images in the Rig Veda. Though this earliest text of the Hindus refers to 3,309 divinities, which were later reduced drastically to only 33. Apparently, there was a parity amongst these 33 at some stage, but gradually distinction emerged amongst them. Some became great, others small. And then came a stage when gods became supreme one by one. Agni, Indra, Som, and Varun emerged as principal gods in turn. This latter phenomenon is called cathenotheism by Max Muller, but Ambedkar doesn't seem to be aware of it. It should have been a riddle for him as to how the Hindus today talk of 330 million gods. There is, however, no such allusion in the riddles. That the Baba Sahib is aware of the phenomenon of the rise and fall of gods and goddesses is significant. Though he is not able to explain it in terms of people's needs to changing milieu. The trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh or Shiv fascinates him considerably. The fights amongst the three, as revealed in the numerous Puranas, have been dealt with in considerable details. At one stage, Brahma is shown to be superior when he acts as an arbitrator between the other two. But later on, the preserver and the destroyer collude to defame the creator. Brahma is accused of committing adultery and incest and almost banished. Ambedkar is not convinced about this explanation because A, such a conduct wasn't unusual in that age, and B, Krishna was guilty of greater immoralities and yet he enjoyed people's favor. Both competition and fierce tussle between Vishnu and Shiva based on the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and the Puranas have been narrated by Ambedkar in great details. Both Ram and Krishna, the two avatars of Vishnu, are called artificial. They are devotees of Shiv and unnatural gods. Godhead was almost thrust upon them, says Ambedkar. But he also says, and I quote, in the Gita, Krishna is greater than all other gods. He is Allahu Akbar, unquote. Preservation of the Chaturvarna was the concern of Vishnu, not of Shiva. Shiva is also seen as an anti-Vedic deity, for he stood against the cult of sacrifices demonstrated in his destruction of the sacrifice of Daksha, his father-in-law. On the relative status of gods and goddesses, Ambedkar has some interesting inferences and provocative observation, almost in contemporary vocabulary. In addition to Prithvi's description as a very ancient Aryan goddess, 16 other goddesses are also recounted from the Rig Veda. Vedic goddesses owed their status through courtesy because they were wives of gods. Obviously, this is wrong because not everyone was wife of God. They never performed any heroic deed. In wars of gods and asuras in Vedas, goddesses did not play any role. Obviously, Ambedkar does not recognize the famous Indra-Usha fight. In contrast, as many as 25 goddesses from the Puranas have been listed. With the long narrative of Durga as Mahishamardani, based on the Markandeya Puran, it is argued that Puranic goddesses had shown their valor in battlefields. Their thunderous deeds made them goddesses. Obviously, this is a very sweeping generalization. Apropos Durga's valors against the Mahish, Puranic gods were shown to be miserable cowards and imbecile. Why? To say that goddesses must be worshipped because they have Shakti is not merely a riddle, but an absurdity, says Ambedkar. It requires an explanation why this doctrine of Shakti was invented. And here, there's a very interesting observation. Was it to put it as a new commodity on the market that the Brahmins started the worship of goddesses and degraded the gods? It is somewhat astonishing that Ambedkar brings out a comparative study based on a Buddhist text named Chulanidesh. He doesn't give its date of composition, but we generally take it to be lying somewhere between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century CE. To demonstrate further fluctuations in the position of Vedic divinities, an emergence of 5 new creeds of Shravakas and as many as 22 Vratikas, cults mostly based on animals and birds. Hindus all over India accept without any shame or remorse the virtue of linga, palace worship. However, citing Professor Dandekar, Vishnu's ancient phallic nature has also been highlighted. Relying on the Rigvedic hymns, where the word Sipivishtu is intimately associated with Vishnu, Dandekar has linked it up philologically with Sep, that is penis. Sipivishtu is understood as the changing phallus, the swelling and the diminishing phallus, and I unquote. Why was the linga worship dissociated from Vishnu and made the preserve of Shiva alone by the Brahmins in the Puranas? That's Ambedkar's query, which is worth probing. Next, riddles on Himsa and Ahimsa. The last 3 riddles of the first part take up the issues of Himsa and Ahimsa. Regrettably, there is quite some incoherence in these. Thus, the 13th riddle, though incomplete, begins with the descriptions of ancient Aryans. This is the first time when Ambedkar uses Aryans in this book, who are identified as race of gamblers and drunkards. The relationship between sexes was also of a loose sort. Marriage was not seen as a permanent tie. Some of the most revered rishis were guilty of bestiality. Both men and women, including Brahmins, enjoyed a variety of intoxicating drinks. It was quite a respectable practice. This is all description about the ancient Aryans. Calling evidence of beef eaters as indisputable, Ambedkar cites numerous examples of citations from the Rig Veda, Dharma Shastras, Markandeya Puran, etc. about flesh eating and kinds of animals whose flesh was permissible or not permissible, and actual eating of flesh. He ends with a few queries. Why did the Brahmins who happily sacrificed cows and feasted every day on beef, with utter disregard to what this does to economy, suddenly turn vegetarian? When did vegetarianism come to India? And when did ahimsa become an established belief? Juxtaposing provisions of the Manusmriti to the tantric way of life, the accentuation of the aforesaid tendencies got underway. The tantric panchmakaras became indispensable. The tantras had no respect for Vedas. Once again, Ambedkar taunts the Brahmins for playing an important role in furthering tantra worship. Brahmins have also been targeted for sanctioning the marriage of Shiva, an ahimsak god, and Kali, a bloodthirsty goddess, as his wife. Why did Brahmins do such a thing? And now on the riddles dealing with the Varna Ashram Dharma. The second part, classified as social, lays much emphasis on Varna and Ashram Dharmas. Put together, they form the steel frame of the Hindu society. Former is the theory of the organization of society. Ashrama Dharma, on the other hand, is the theory of regulating the life of an individual. The Vedas are somewhat silent on the latter, while the allusion to Chaturvarna in the Rig Veda is shown to be a concoction of the Brahmins. Neither on the question of their origin, nor on the issue of implied hierarchy is there any unanimity in Sanskrit textual tradition. So goes the argument of Ambedkar. He even cites the Harivamsha Puran, going to the length of saying that the Shudras are twice born. Manusmriti is the best source for an exposition of the ashrama system. There are three features according to Manu. One, it is not open to the Shudras and women. Two, Brahmacharya and Grahasthashram are compulsory. And third, one must pass from one stage to another in sequence without bypassing any. However, Dharma Sutras provide evidence of deviations from Manu's prescriptions. Further, giving in a tabular form the rules prescribed for Vanaprastha and Sannyasa by Manu, Ambedkar shows that there was so little difference in the stages that it baffled him why Manu insisted on both being followed compulsorily. The whole scheme of Manu rests on the principle that marriage is compulsory. Why did Manu make escape from marriage impossible? The new system of ordered sequential following of 4 ashramas as laid down by Manu brought hardships and cruelty to wives and children. Manu regarded marriage as superior stage and foundation of all other stages. Apparently, he discouraged persons from becoming sannyasi as was possible for a Buddhist. One need not be a grahasth to be a bhikkhu. Much emphasis has been laid on Manu's schema of varnas, especially on his elaborate listing of varna sankaras, mixed caste born out of several permutations and combinations of higher and lower varnas through anulom and pratilom marriages. Ambedkar amuses us by calling this gigantic exercise as Manu's madness. Ambedkar has been quite exceptional in providing long charts of mixed castes given by Manu as well as of amendments made by his successors, both Smritikaras and writers of Dharma Sutras. Apart from pointing out numerous discrepancies, Ambedkar also identifies some lacunae in Manu's prescriptions. To illustrate, Manu does not mention Sankara, born out of marriage of Brahmin and Kshatriyas, and whether progeny of this was Pratilom or Anulom. Several questions have been asked by Baba Sahib. Why did Manu fail to deal with this question? Is it to be supposed that such a Sankara did not occur in his time? Or was he afraid to mention it? If so, of whom was he afraid? Baba Sahib has also made a very damning indictment on fictitious names of Sankaras mentioned by Manu and other Smritikaras. And I quote, some of the names of the mixed caste mentioned by Manu and the other Smritikaras appear to be quite fictitious. For some of the communities mentioned as being of bastard origin have never been heard of before Manu, nor does anyone know what has happened to them since. They are today non-existent without leaving any trace behind. Caste is an insoluble substance, and once a caste is formed, it maintains its separate existence, unless for any special reason it dies out. this can happen but to few, unquote. This reminds me of Kosambi's critique of John Brow's translation of Gotra Pravar Manjari of Purushottam Pandit under the title The Early Brahmanical System of Gotra and Pravar. He rejects Brow's contentions about Purushottam Pandita's list as being closed, and occasional allusion to Gotras in relatively small number of inscriptions as discordances and fictitious. Recognizing the impossibility of finding a unitary definitive Gotra list for all time, Kosambi lays considerable emphasis on the need for fieldwork plus search in inscriptions to understand the fluidity of Gotra lists. He showed through his own personal experience of fieldwork how such a methodology would supplement textual manuscripts and throw up evidences of Gotras getting extinct and some new ones enrolled from the non-Aryan or non-Brahmanized families and tribes. Did Manu realize that by propounding his theory of the origin of the mixed caste, he was assigning an ignoble origin to vast number of people of this country, leading to their social and moral degradation? Why did he say that the castes were mixed in origin, when as a matter of fact they were independent in their existence? After being so toxic, Ambedkar gives credit for at least one positive note in Manu's formulation of Sankaras. In cases where mother belongs to a Varna more than 1 degree lower to that of father, which means Brahmin father plus Vaishya or Shudra mother, child will not have father's Varna. Manu does not go beyond saying this, but all commentators of Manu, Vedatiti, Kalluk Bhatt, Narad and Nanda Pandit, agree in saying that the Varna of the child in such cases shall be that of mother. Why did Manu occasion such a change in the law from Pitra Savarnya, according to father's Varna, to Matra Savarnya, according to mother's Varna? On the Kali Yuga, there are a few riddles. Ambedkar devotes 3 chapters on the Brahmanic dogma of 4-fold yugas, namely Krita, Treta, Dwapar, and Kali Yuga. Questions are raised by Ambedkar about the prohibitions that are imposed in the Kali Yuga, which are called Kali Varjyas. And he asks the questions, are these practices condemned as being immoral, sinful, or otherwise harmful to society? For example, beginning of food by a sannyasin from persons of all varnas, including Shudra. The answer is no. Since these practices are forbidden, why are they not condemned? Further, why have the Brahmins made Kali Yuga unending? Was it to blackmail some Shudra kings that the theory of Kali Yuga was invented and made unending so as to destroy his subjects from having any faith in his rule? Curiously, in one piece on the Kali age, Ambedkar narrates in extenso the religion of ancient Aryans. In his view, it was full of barbaric and obscene observances. Human sacrifice, worship of genitals, the cult of phallus known as Skambha were part of Aryan religion. He goes into extensive details of obscenities in performance of the Ashwamedh sacrifice. Morals of ancient Aryans were no better than their religion. He reiterates that they were a race of gamblers and drunkards. Wine formed the most essential part of religion. Promiscuity in matters of sex becomes quite apparent if one were only to examine rules of Niyog. Brahmins used to sell their wives. Rishis had no qualms in indulging in bestiality. Ayonijas were children born of immaculate conceptions. Both Sita and Draupadi were Ayonijas. Many of us would probably be able to recall that for far less hostile but historically well-rooted descriptions of Aryans, Professor R. S. Sharma's textbook entitled Ancient India was banned in 1977 by the then government of India, which had a powerful component of Janasangh, earlier avatar of the BJP. Later on, in October 2001, several passages of similar nature were sought to be removed from Professor Romila Thapar's textbook on Ancient India for Class 6 for their so-called anti-Brahmin bias and hurting religious sentiments of the Hindus. This was at the behest of the first NDA government with the distinct majority of the BJP. Riddles on Brahmaism and Rama and Krishna. I'll take up Rama and Krishna in greater detail. The riddle of Ram and Krishna, which caused a massive political furor for understandable reasons, given the time of its publication in 1987, its basic question, is Ram a worthy personality of deification? This must have been seen as highly offensive. Starting with Rama's birth being described as unnatural, it goes to explicate God's wholesale acts of fornication against even lawfully wedded wives in order to make Rama's avatar completely successful. Rama's birth is thus accompanied by general debauchery, so argues Ambedkar. He also cites the Buddha Ramayana, which is obviously a mistake for the Dasharath Jatak, to show that both Ram and Sita were siblings born of Dasharath. Several unethical acts of Ram as an individual have been listed. His attack on Vali, for example, is considered a planned and premeditated murder. Rama's treatment of Sita, particularly after the killing of Ravana, has received very strong condemnation, and his conduct is seen as extremely cruel. Not only her chastity is suspected by Ram, but he had the gumption to tell her on her face, and I quote, "I have got you as a prize in a war after conquering my enemy, your captor. I have recovered my honor and punished my enemy. I am glad my labors have been rewarded. I came here to kill Ravan and wash off the dishonor. I did not take this trouble for you, for your sake," unquote. Sita's abandonment after her return to Ayodhya on the suspicious town gossip of her unchastity has also been seen as a cruel act. Ultimately, Sita preferred to die rather than return to Ram, who had behaved no better than a brute. I mention here incidentally that Bhairappa's novel in Kannada, Uttarakhand, which has been recently translated into English under the same title, brings out very sensitively Sita's reflections on her life with Ram on the basis of descriptions in the Uttarakhand. Ambedkar is not appreciative of Rama's conduct as a king either. Rama spent more time in his harem, Ambedkar calls it Zanana, and left the day-to-day work of ruling to Bharata. Finally, beheading of Shudra's Shambhu. Death of a young son of Brahmin was an occasion when the Lord of Ayodhya was approached. Rama was told that it couldn't have been possible without some hidden sin committed within his realm. Search was on, and it was found that a Shudra named Shambhu was carrying on an austere tapasya, which was forbidden for him and was meant for only the twice born. Shambhu was doing so to go to heaven in his own earthly person. Ram did not give him any opportunity to explain his conduct and cut off his head on the spot. And lo and behold, at that very moment, the dead boy of the Brahmin in distant Ayodhya began to breathe again. Gods rejoiced. Rama was felicitated by sage Agastya with a divine bracelet. I'm now coming to the final part of my presentation. A few words more on the publication of the riddles. It's now understood that following his resignation from Nehru's cabinet in 1951, due to the impasse on the Hindu Code Bill, Dr. Ambedkar was looking for some secretarial assistance. He reverted to Nanak Chand Rattu, a Punjabi Adharmi Dalit, whom he had known since January 1940. Between October 1951 and December 1956, Rattu had typed out almost all of Ambedkar's letters and papers. Ambedkar died on 6 December 1956, intestate. On Rattu's account, Riddles was finally completed by November 1955, but its publication was held up as Ambedkar wanted to add two important photographs. The first was of Dr. Rajendra Prasad, the first president of the Republic, visiting Banaras in 1952, worshipping Brahmins, washing their feet and drinking the water. The second photo related to Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, who on 15th of August 1947 sat at the yajna performed by the Brahmins of Banaras to celebrate the event of a Brahmin becoming the first Prime Minister of free and independent India. Nehru is said to have worn the Rajdanda given to him by the Brahmins and drank the water of the Ganga brought by them. Ratu notes that while Dr. Rajendra Prasad's photo had become available, search was on for the photo of Nehru. Ambedkar too makes note of these two incidents in his work, Thoughts on Linguistic States, which is a critique of the report of the States Reorganization Commission completed in December 1955. Finally, about Ambedkar's views on civilization. Dr. Ambedkar had his own take on civilization. His long essay entitled Civilization or Felony deserves serious consideration. Apparently, the piece was written well before the partition, for he denounces Hindu and Muslim extremists upholding the two-nation theory in unmistakable terms. He quotes, "In between these two extremists, there are sober persons who are for a state in which both Hindus and Muslims can live as equal partners. The struggle that is going on between the Hindus and the Muslims is really a struggle of the classes. It is not a struggle of the masses," unquote. A long passage from his article mentioned above, and I quote, "Civilization is comprising an accumulated store of knowledge of man and nature, of arts and crafts, an ethical code regulating the conduct of man towards his fellows, a social code laying down the forms and conventions to be observed by individuals, a civil code prescribing the rights and duties of the rulers and the ruled, and a religious creed relating the natural to the supernatural is a rare prize. It has not been the good fortune of all races to develop it in all its fullness. Many have stood where they were at the start. Many took one or two steps and have been at a halt. Others have only revolved round and round," unquote. Pleading for seeing Indian people beyond their linguistic and religious identities, Ambedkar focuses on the need for seeing social and economic life of certain classes who fall within the Hindu fold. On the basis of the 1931 census, Ambedkar talks of what he called colossal sunken humanity, unquote, comprising of millions of primitives, millions of criminals, and 50 million untouchable, all put together a population of 79.5 million. The saddening, and if one may say annoying part of the story is, this is Ambedkar's quote, that the state of these unfortunate human beings should be what it is, although they are surrounded and fed by a high civilization. It is the boast of every patriotic Hindu that the Hindus or the Vedic civilization is the oldest in the world. One often hears with fearsome repetitions of a Hindu stating with a certain degree of malicious pride that India had reached a very high degree of civilization when other people were leading a primitive life and moving naked. The main point is not whether the civilization is ancient and whether it has survived. The principal question is this Hindu civilization the social heritage, a burden, or a benefit? Would it be unjust if they, the sunken humanity, said that this is not civilization, this is infamy? Would it be wrong if the untouchable said that is felony and not civilization? It must strike any impartial observer that there must be something very radically wrong with a civilization which has failed to elevate to their manhood 79.5 millions of human beings, unquote. To Baba Sahab, all this is attributable to the basic principles of the Hindu civilization, namely the Chaturvarna Dharma. In conclusion, I would like to leave you with the following three riddles of my own. 1. Why did Ambedkar constantly use Hinduism, which was essentially a construct created by the British on the advice of influential Orthodox pundits? Didn't he realize that the word Hindu does not figure in any of Sanskrit texts that he was consistently invoking to make his substantive points? 2. Why is Ambedkar silent on Hindutva? Surely he would have known about it. After all, Dr. Munjay, with whom he had his preliminary negotiations in 1935 regarding his thoughts on conversion, had handed over the presidentship of the Hindu Mahasabha to Vinayak Damodar Savarkar the main ideologue of Hindutva in 1937. Third, Ambedkar's language in denouncing Hinduism and the so-called Hindu textual tradition is harsh and provocative, to put it very politely. The Vedas are a worthless set of books. That's his quote. There is no reason either to call them sacred or infallible. These worthless books contain nothing but invocation to tribal gods to destroy their enemies, loot their property, and give it to their followers, unquote. Isn't it surprising that even such a decisive outburst hasn't hurt the religious sentiments of the cultural nationalists of today? In the contemporary milieu, lesser people would have been branded anti-national and seditious for expressing such views. And yet, isn't it perplexing? Why has the present political establishment been able to appropriate Ambedkar and win the hearts of the Dalits and untouchables, whose cause was most dear to Baba Sahib? That Dr. Ambedkar, along with an approximately 5 lakh followers, chose to seek Diksha into Buddhism at Nagpur is very significant. Since it has been the headquarters of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, was Baba Sahib trying to send a symbolic message of his rebellion from the Hindu order? That RSS and the other constituents of the Sangha Parivar chose to demolish the Babri Masjid on the 6th December 1992, the 36th anniversary of the Mahaparinirvana of Baba Sahib, was also perhaps not a mere coincidence. Was this the case of the Newtonian third law of motion, that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction? The dialectics of this relationship still needs to be deciphered, or it may provide us with some new insights for comprehending civilizational process in a nuanced manner. I would like to acknowledge my gratitude to Dr. Ratan Lal, my former student and one who did his doctoral thesis with me, because he has been running a YouTube channel, AmbedakrNama, and he's already done something like 200 episodes there. This AmbedakrNama has been my source of inspiration for this presentation. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Professor Banga, and all the participants for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shrimali, for a fascinating presentation. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Should we have questions now first?
Yes. There are a couple of questions. Professor Shrimali, there are two questions that may go together. One is about Ambedkar's views on Rama's behavior with conduct with Shurpanaka, and the other is about Ravana. The second set of questions is actually more contemporary, asking for a comparison with Gandhiji and his views on village life.
Sorry, I'm not getting that.
Gandhiji, the comparison with Gandhi and his understanding of village life. The second is the understanding of Indian civilization as a composite culture.
Well, as far as the first question is concerned, the riddle from which I read out the extracts has no reference to either Shurpanakha or Ravana, except to underline, as I have mentioned, that Rama was more concerned about showing his own valor against Ravana, but there is nothing more on Ravana himself. And what was the second question?
The second question was on self-governing village.
I'm sorry, this doesn't concern me. As far as my subject was concerned, Ambedkar has nothing to say on that, and I'm sure there are more knowledgeable participants. I can see Salil Mishra here, and they are more competent to talk about it. So I would much rather leave that. And finally, what was the third question?
Third one was on composite culture.
On composite culture, well, since I have focused only on one monograph of Ambedkar, I'm not claiming to be a scholar of Ambedkar writings. The essay that I mentioned on civilization, if we go by the initial part of that and his comments on the extremes on the Muslim and the Hindu sides, and giving us a hint that he was not really standing for the two-nation theory, then one can perhaps infer that he was more in tune with the pluralistic character of the Hindus and of Indians than with the proponents of the two-nation theory.
That is all as far as questions are concerned.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Right, thank you. So could we now have the third presentation by Professor Rezvi?
Thank you. Let